Good morning and welcome to another Daily Word. It is Thursday, July 16th, and we find ourselves in Acts 26. And I want to read to you one of my favorite illustrations regarding a historical hero of mine, Hugh Latimer, who was a preacher around the 14 and 1500s. And one time he preached for King Henry VIII. And the way that he exhibited boldness and passion and conviction actually reflects Paul in this particular chapter that is part of your reading. And so follow along with me on this brief story as we see the way that Hugh Latimer exhibited boldness. He preached before King Henry VIII, who was known as a nasty king in history, and Henry was greatly displeased by the boldness in the sermon and ordered Latimer to preach it again the following week and then to apologize for the offense that he had given. The next Sunday, after reading his text, Latimer began his sermon, and he read this way, even in the third person a little bit. Hugh Latimer, dost thou know who before thou art this day to speak Old English? To the high and mighty monarch, the king's most excellent majesty, who can take away life if thou dost offend us. Therefore, take heed that thou speakest not a word that may displease, but then consider well, Hugh, dost thou not know from whence thou comest? Do you not know upon whose message thou art sent? Even by the great and mighty God, who is all present, and who beholdeth all thy ways, and who is able to cast thy soul into hell. Therefore, take care that thou deliverest thy message faithfully. Hugh contrasting standing before King Henry, giving an account, and standing before God, who holds him accountable to be faithful. Latimer then preached the same sermon he had preached the preceding Sunday, and even did so with considerably more energy. How is that for passion? How's that for boldness? How's that for logic on fire and passion and conviction? Church, that is the kind of boldness that the Apostle Paul lived and preached with. It is the kind of boldness that we are called to follow or imitate in our own life, with our own gifts, in our own contexts, in the ways that God provides us to live out today. And that looks like something, though, and there's an attitude that we are to have while we're living boldly for Jesus. Paul finds himself in front of King Agrippa in this chapter, and instead of only appealing to his innocence and only giving testimony to essentially get himself free because he wanted to keep preaching the gospel, he also goes straight for the heart. He goes for conversion. Paul keeps the gospel front and center. At one point, King Agrippa says to him, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? You'll see that in verse 28. Basically, Paul gives him the gospel and says, King Agrippa, don't you see the prophets and their teaching? I know you believe. I know you see this is true. He's appealing to the logic and the mind of King Agrippa. And Paul says in response, whether short or long, I would to God, in verse 29, that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. In other words, I hope you all get saved, follow Jesus, to become a Christian, and are just like I am, except not in chains. Now, when they declare him innocent, in verse 31, when they withdraw, and they said to one another, this man has done nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. That is the fifth time that Paul is declared innocent. And yet, he's still in chains. I've noticed that the governor and now the king have declared him innocent. Reminds me of the Gospel of Luke recording a king and a governor declaring Jesus innocent. And yet Jesus still to the cross and Paul still in chains. Why do I bring up that parallel? Is because their example. Along the way, there certainly can be appeals, and Paul made those. But the attitude of Paul, the attitude of Jesus, was boldness and yet a humility to follow God's plan, a humility and attitude of surrender to God's will and God's way, and yet a holy fire, a boldness to preach the gospel, to point out the truth. And so as you and I navigate these waters in today's culture and the political climate heats up and opinions and preferences abound, I want to challenge you, church. In all your bold truth speaking, do you have an attitude that is focused on the gospel? Is the gospel front and center? Is Jesus your model? Are we fighting for our own rights, or are we fighting for the truth of God's word? Are we pulling the I'm an American card and this is my country, although it's important to be a good citizen? We are citizens of heaven. Paul was a Roman citizen. He appealed to his Roman citizenship. He used what he could most certainly to ensure that he could preserve his life for the preaching of the gospel. And so even today for us as Christians in America, we don't want to preserve our rights and freedoms simply to have our rights and freedoms. We want to do so with an attitude that is determined to continue to preach the gospel. Why? Because Jesus is the solution, isn't he? He's the solution for America. He's the solution for China, for South America, for Canada, for Europe, and the whole world. And so yes, use your logic. Yes, stand for truth. Yes, fight for rights and stand for rights and freedoms of Americans and for the innocent. But overall, keep the gospel front and center and keep an attitude of humility and trust in the midst of it, just like Paul and just like Jesus. I love you, church. Hope that challenges you and encourages you today.